The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me all right here. I think we can get started now. So welcome, everybody, to this Getting Started with NativeScript webinar. Just so you know, the goal here is to get you all as comfortable as possible with some of the tools and services that we really think are the best ways for you to get up and running with NativeScript. Really, we want to make you feel as comfortable as possible as you evaluate NativeScript for your app development. So my name is Rob Lauer, even though it says Dan Wilson in the GoToWebinar window there. Actually, it shows up as two Dan Wilsons, but I assure you it is Rob Lauer and TJ Van Tol. So I run the Progress Mobility Developer Relations team. Along with me, as I mentioned, is TJ Van Tol. He is our principal developer advocate. Now, the way this is going to work is TJ is going to provide us probably about a 10 to 15 minute walkthrough of how to get up and running with NativeScript as quickly as possible. During this time, I'll be fielding questions, so feel free to use that Q&A window provided in GoToWebinar to ask those questions. At the end of TJ's demonstration, we're going to do probably about a 10-15 minute Q&A as well with some of the best questions we receive. And I want to make a note that when we're done today, you should get an email within about an hour with some additional resources, but also a survey. The survey is going to help us to kind of better craft this webinar going forward and make sure we're providing the right message to you all. And we do repeat these webinars about every 3 weeks or so. And this one's actually being recorded, and we'll make it available on YouTube if you happen to miss anything. Now, before TJ started, I did want to kind of mention that as many of you likely know by now, NativeScript really is the way to take your web skills and build truly native mobile apps for iOS and Android. You do get native UI and native performance out of the box. You are using JavaScript and CSS. You can optionally use frameworks like Angular or Vue and a friendly markup language for that native UI. Now, I wanted to start with a question we often get asked that I'm going to go ahead and take the liberty to answer right away is what some of the major differences are between NativeScript and, say, like an Ionic or React Native. I would start by saying that all three are really great ways to develop cross-platform apps. In terms of Ionic, you are using Cordova or PhoneGap, which means you are using web views for UI, which can lead to some performance issues. You are also relying on Cordova plugins to access native device features, which can be buggy or maybe missing entirely, while NativeScript does provide access to 100% of both iOS and Android device APIs out of the box without having to rely on plugins. Now, React Native, on the other hand, gives you that performance you expect, but again, you are relying on the framework itself to catch up to new device APIs before you can generally use them. React Native is also quote unquote limited to React, obviously a very popular framework, so not that limiting, but we do support Angular and Vue.js, or even just plain JavaScript or TypeScript. So again, all three are sound options, but you should know there are some differences between them. There's a lot more to it than that, so I'm going to hand it over to the real expert here, TJ. So go ahead, TJ.
All right. Yeah, thanks, Rob. So as Rob mentioned, my name is TJ, not Dan Wilson, because apparently online webinar software is very hard. And just to sort of quickly summarize what we're going to do is we're going to start with just a little bit of an intro. I'm going to point out a few things that I think are really important to know if you're new to NativeScript. And then we'll spend the bulk of our time looking at some actual demos. So I'm going to build a few little simple applications with a real eye on trying to give you some tips as to where I think you could be most successful when you start to develop your own NativeScript apps. And as Rob mentioned, but I'll just repeat one more time here, that if you do have any questions, maybe some things that have come up as you've started to experiment with NativeScript already, or maybe you have some questions that come up from something I'm showing, again, feel free to use the Q&A panel in GoToWebinar, and we'll tackle those towards the end of this event. So I did want to start with just a quick sort of a lightning round of a few things that I think are important to really know about NativeScript. The first is that everything we do with NativeScript is open source. So if you go to github.com/NativeScript, you can find all the various repositories that make up the NativeScript ecosystem. So if you're the type of person that likes to sort of get involved in these projects or follow along, just know that is available for you. NativeScript is also completely free to use. We license the NativeScript framework under the Apache 2 license, which in sort of plain English, plain terms, just means that you can use NativeScript in your own applications, whether they are personal or professional corporate applications. And you can do so without having to pay us anything. So feel free to use NativeScript. There's no cost to doing so. Next, NativeScript, one of our more, I'd say, compelling features is that, or the thing that separates us from some other frameworks that we'll look at here in a minute, is that we use completely native user interface components to build your applications. Now, for you as the user of NativeScript, this really gets you two things. First, your applications get the performance that you'd expect out of a native iOS or Android application. At runtime, your applications are really indistinguishable from native apps because we're actually using the same native controls. And second, your apps get the UX you'd expect from the native applications for these devices as well. We're not doing things like styling buttons to make them look like native buttons. We're actually using the completely native controls out of the box. So your apps really look and feel like they belong on the platforms that you're building for. But at the same time, we try to let you build these applications using tooling that you may already be familiar with, especially if you're coming from a web development background. So with NativeScript, you build your applications using JavaScript for your source code. You can optionally use TypeScript on top of that. You style your applications using a subset of CSS. You can optionally use Sass on top of that. And we use some other tools you might be familiar with, like NPM for dependency management. We use Webpack to optimize your applications, get them ready for production. And you can also use Angular or Vue as sort of a layer of building up things like data binding and event binding and other things you might need to do as part of your app development processes. So Rob touched on this, but one of our real characterizing features of NativeScript is that we give you some choices in terms of how you choose to build your applications. So NativeScript at its sort of lowest level is really just a tool that lets JavaScript drive a native iOS or Android application. So if you're the type of developer that likes to keep your dependencies kind of lean, you can use NativeScript with just JavaScript and nothing else on top of it. You can optionally, though, use TypeScript for your NativeScript app development. We on the NativeScript teams are pretty big fans of TypeScript. I know I personally like TypeScript. A lot of the NativeScript source code is actually written in TypeScript as well. So I think you'll find our TypeScript tooling is really quite excellent and something that you might want to use for your own applications. And finally, we do support both the Angular and Vue.js frameworks. So if you have some existing Angular expertise, maybe you use Angular for your sort of day-to-day web app development, or same thing with Vue, you might find it's kind of nice to actually build native applications using some of those same skill sets. Now, finally, and I'm just going to breeze through this since Rob already touched on it a little bit, these are questions that come up a lot. This is one reason why we talk about this a lot, but just NativeScript in comparison to some other tools that you might already know and might already be familiar with. So with Cordova or PhoneGap or Ionic, the biggest difference is that with NativeScript, you are not using HTML, you are not using the DOM, we are using native user interface components. Now, as you'll see here in a minute, this turns out to be both a good thing and a bad thing for you as a developer. The great thing is you get the sort of performance and UX that you'd expect. The sort of challenge is learning some of the way that you actually build up your interfaces using NativeScript, and we'll see what that looks like here momentarily. The next one, and Rob didn't mention this one, but Xamarin comes up a decent amount as well. Now, Xamarin's interesting because at runtime, Xamarin actually also uses native user interface components. So lots of times you can't actually tell the difference between a NativeScript app and a Xamarin app at runtime. But during development time, this sort of architectural stacks we use are quite a bit different, mainly the language. With NativeScript, you are using JavaScript to create your apps. Xamarin is C#. It's more sort of baked into the .NET universe. So the skills that you're using to actually create your applications are quite a bit different, even if they are quite similar at runtime. And finally, React Native. The big difference here is really in framework. So if we go back to, I talked about that you have architectural choices with NativeScript, some choices, some different options that you can use to build your applications. With React Native, you are using React, which if you are a React developer, that's great. But if you're not, with NativeScript, you have a lot more choices in terms of how you choose to build your applications. So I want to actually, I think a lot of this is easier just to see in action. So I want to switch over to the demo part of this sort of event and show you what it looks like to actually build a NativeScript application. So I'm going to switch over to this environment called the NativeScript Playground. And if you're the type of person that likes to sort of multitask or sort of tinker around while you're watching this, you can try it for yourself by just heading to play.nativescript.org. The great thing about NativeScript Playground is it gives you a way that you can develop your applications in the browser without really any dependencies. So you don't have to have an iOS environment configured, an Android device configured. You can build, if you're on Windows, on Mac, or Linux, you can build and deploy your apps to, you can actually preview your apps, iOS applications from Windows, for example. And the sort of unique thing about this environment is, if you remember earlier, I said that NativeScript is not actually using HTML or the DOM at all. So you'll note there's no sort of preview here of what your application looks like, because your NativeScript apps don't actually run on the web. So what you'll do instead is hit this QR code button, and this is going to show you a way of previewing your application. So I'm going to put this over here, and I'm going to drag my iOS device that I'm mirroring over here so you can see these things side by side. And if you download the NativeScript Playground app, which you can find in the App Store and Google Play, there's links over here, and I've got it on my phone, so I'm going to go ahead and update it. You can scan this QR code and essentially make a link between the application you're developing here in your browser and what you see over here on your device. And also, when you make changes to your app, so if I just get super oddly excited about this title here and save it, notice how you are able to see those changes instantaneously on your device. Now, what's cool about this is, remember, I didn't just update a label here. This is an actual, since this is an iOS app, this is a UI label native control. So you get a workflow that feels very much like web development. You're saving your changes and seeing them instantaneously, but you're actually working in a native ecosystem. So this is the equivalent of starting up a new application up in Xcode and firing that up on, say, an iOS simulator and finding where a UI label is and then going through a full compilation after you make that change. But with NativeScript, all this is happening with a fairly familiar workflow for you, especially if you're coming from a web development background. So if we look around this Playground interface here, I'll introduce you to a few of the more, I think, convenient things to know about. Now, this happens to be an Angular application. If you're an Angular developer, you might recognize some of the sort of naming conventions and files that I'm using over here. If you want to switch to a different architecture, if you're more of a Vue person or you're just not a framework person at all, you can use this new menu to switch between the various architectures. But regardless of which you use, there's going to be 3 different file types that you're going to see throughout your NativeScript applications. So the first is going to be JavaScript or TypeScript, and this is probably going to be what's most familiar to you, because with NativeScript, we're not doing anything sort of funny or unique to the JavaScript language, or TypeScript for that matter either. So the code you write here is just going to be really identical to what you write on the web. And in some cases, and I'll show this later, you're actually able to share quite a bit of your code between web applications and native applications because it's just JavaScript or it's just TypeScript. So you probably already know how this works. The second is CSS. So I mentioned earlier that in NativeScript, you use CSS to style these controls. So if, for example, I want all my labels to be blue, I could type that in here and sort of instantly change my app of what I'm seeing here. Now, I did also mention, if you're paying attention, that we use a subset of CSS for NativeScript. Because, again, remember that I don't have a browser over here. So I couldn't just take, for example, a web CSS file, toss it in here, and expect things to work exactly the same. In NativeScript, what we actually do is we take the CSS rules that you write here, we parse them, and we apply the native equivalent of these rules that you write. So, for example, for color blue, we find the sort of APIs for changing a UI label's color over here on iOS, and we apply it to make this color change happen. And what that means is that there's essentially a whitelist of CSS properties that you can use in NativeScript. And all the big ones work, so things related to color, background color, things related to sizing, so like height, width, margin padding, all of those work as well. So I think you'll find that a lot of things here are familiar. The same CSS parsing rules also apply for, you use selectors exactly as you do on the web. You apply name value pairs and all of these things as well. But just note that there are some properties that aren't going to work just because they're not things that can easily be made to work in an iOS and an Android environment. So I said 3 file types. The first was JavaScript or TypeScript. The second was CSS. The last one we're going to look at is the markup part of NativeScript. And this is where I personally find that the biggest learning curve comes into play when you come to NativeScript, because you probably already know how JavaScript or TypeScript works, at least a little bit. You're probably at least a little bit familiar with the CSS language and how it works, although there's a little bit of learning which properties work in NativeScript and which do not. But when you come to NativeScript, you probably don't know what a stack layout or a label or a scroll view, what they do, because they are specific to how NativeScript works. So I'm going to give you a few recommendations for learning exactly how this markup works. So one is directly within this playground environment, one thing you can do is take the UI components you see in this bottom left pane and just directly drag them into your interface. So if I bring this button out and save it, I can see what a button looks like on this iOS device. I can label we already did. Maybe I'll take a slider or something and I'll drag that out too. You can just start tinkering around and seeing what UI components are here and what you can do with them. So I did a couple of them. You can, so there's the simple ones here, which I started with. If you scroll down here, though, you can get to some pretty intense ones. Like we have a full charting library in NativeScript, so I can bring candlestick charts or whatever these things are, save them, and instantly see them on my device and see how they render here. I think this is start to tinker around and get familiar with what NativeScript offers and what these things can do. So I'd recommend after you start to get familiar with what you're doing in here and the development workflow you need to build NativeScript apps, playing around with this components page is a great way to take the next step and just familiarize yourself with the building blocks you need to build user interfaces in NativeScript. The other thing I'll mention is we haven't talked too much about layout, so stack layout, grid layout as well. So there's a site that you'll want to bookmark here called NativeScript Layouts, nslayouts.com. And it's a site that's based off, it's sort of inspired by Flexbox Froggy, if anybody's familiar with that for learning Flexbox on the web. But it's specifically for learning what the NativeScript layouts are and what they do. So when you get to that point in your app development process and you're trying to align things on the screen, I'd recommend checking those out. And I keep a special eye on Flexbox layout. That's my personal favorite way to lay things out with NativeScript, just because it's using the exact same syntax you can use to lay out things with Flexbox on the web. So just to sort of summarize things for the Playground environment here, when you're starting with NativeScript, Playground is really the first place that we recommend that you check out. It's easy. There's no real system requirements you need to have in place. You just download a Playground app to your device. You start building an application. Once you get familiar with the basic workflow, I'd start playing with some of these components, maybe check out nslayouts.com for learning how layouts work. At that point, I'd recommend heading to this Get Started menu and check out the interactive tutorials. There are a handful of tutorials that are baked directly into this Playground experience designed to sort of help you with taking the next steps for learning NativeScript. The Getting Started one is kind of going to be a repeat of what I've already covered here today. It's just going to walk you through workflow things and finding things in Playground and whatnot. But the Build a Full App tutorial is like a 18-step. It's a pretty good-sized tutorial that's going to take you beyond the basics and learning how to build an actual real application with NativeScript. So once you've met those earlier steps, that's certainly what I would check out. So this is Playground. Again, we recommend getting started here. But at some point, you are probably going to hit some limitations of Playground. Playground cannot do everything you need to do complete NativeScript development. For example, Playground's not going to be able to build the actual binaries you need to submit to the iOS App Store or Google Play, for example. So at some point, you'll want to switch over to really our other development option we have with NativeScript, and that's the NativeScript command line interface, or CLI. Now, if you head to the NativeScript documentation, you're going to find an article kind of near the top here on CLI setup for the NativeScript CLI. And you'll see that there's actually two different setup options. So I'll get into that in a second. The quick setup option is where you're going to want to start. And all you're going to need to do for that is install the NativeScript CLI from npm. So it's going to be npm install-g NativeScript. And what that's going to let you do, and I've got a little sample app over here, is I have a new app that I created. So with the NativeScript CLI, once you, just to spell this out one more time, you would npm install-g NativeScript. And from there, you have this command called tns, which is just short for Telerik NativeScript. It's just the command you use to do NativeScripty things. You can use tns create to start new applications. It'll sort of guide you through the steps you need to take to build a new application. And then once you have that, you're actually able to run a command called tns preview. And this, you'll find, is going to work a lot like the NativeScript Playground, in that it's going to spit out a QR code for me. And I'm going to go grab my device mirror over here so you can see what I'm doing. And I'll go back and I'll scan this QR code. And what this is going to do, it's going to launch this sort of simple Hello World app that I have here up on my device. And then if I go into an editor, so I'm a fan of VS Code, so I'll jump in here. And if I make a change to my app, notice how in a second here, it's going to update on my device here as well. So At this point, with the quick setup from the NativeScript CLI, you really have the exact same workflow you had in Playground, but at this point, you're now working locally. So you can use whatever editor you like to use and any local tooling you like, but you still get that nice sort of dependency-free version of developing with NativeScript. Now, at some point too, sort of our final step in this progression is at some point you might outgrow the quick setup as well, because the quick setup is not actually building full iOS and Android native applications. It's just using that exact same preview infrastructure. And at some point you will need to go through the full setup process. And this is where you're going to actually need to install iOS and Android dependencies. Our docs will walk you through how to do this, but there is a little bit of time you'll need to invest to get everything in place for iOS and Android development. But what you can do once you have this set up is pretty cool. So I've got another app over here that I've been working on earlier. And once you have the full setup in place, you can run this command called tns run. And you can also pass it a new flag we have in the latest version of NativeScript called HMR, which is short for hot module replacement, hot module replacement. And what that does, so I'm going to bring over this app that I'm working on here. And I've got HMR already running in a different tab of my terminal here. And if this is going to work correctly, if I go in here and make changes to my TypeScript code, for example, I change my password here, I can just see the updates immediately on my device. And you can hook up multiple devices to this sort of thing. I could get out my Android device, my iPad, a bunch of things, and start tinkering around. And the NativeScript CLI is going to recognize that device. It's going to push the changes out to all those devices. And with HMR, you get the ability to see those changes pretty much instantaneously. So hopefully, I don't want to go on too long here because I want to use some of your questions to help guide some of this discussion as well. But the very last thing I'll mention before I turn things over to Rob is that with the full setup, one thing to keep in mind is that you are actually building native iOS and Android applications locally. And so if you are on Windows, for example, that does mean that you are unable to build iOS applications because iOS app development requires Xcode, which only runs on a Mac. So we do have this tool called NativeScript Sidekick, which is a tool that will let you perform your builds in the cloud. So if you're sort of intimidated by the local setup, or if you are on, say, Windows or Linux and you need to build iOS applications, Sidekick is one option you have once you get to the sort of full build part of your application development processes, and it's another tool that you might want to check out. I think that might be it, Rob. I think the only other thing I was going to talk about is the marketplace, but that might come up through questions and such. Have we had some good questions coming in?
Yeah, a bunch of good questions have come in. Actually, I think that it'd be a perfect time to talk about the marketplace if you want to do that quickly.
Yeah, so another resource that's out there that we just like to make sure people know about when they're getting started with NativeScript is the NativeScript Marketplace. It's up at market.nativescript.org. And there's a couple different tabs that you can see here. One is related to plugins. So one of the things that we think is really cool about the NativeScript ecosystem is that we have a lot of plugins. We're getting close to 1,000 at this point. And where the marketplace comes in is, say you're building an app and you know you're going to need some piece of, I don't know, like hardware, like I need to use the camera. Well, you can find a camera plugin that makes it easy to use the camera in your NativeScript app, or Bluetooth, or maybe you need to use some sort of other service, like you need a Firebase plugin or a Facebook plugin or Kinvey or fingerprint authentication. It's a good place to go to just see what plugins are out there. You might want to, again, to multitask right now. If you know you need something for the next app that you're going to build, the marketplace plugin search is a good place to just sort of explore and see what's out there. The second thing I'll show is the samples tabs here as well. I got to get rid of my filter here. And what the samples tab is just a number of copy and paste friendly code samples that you might sort of need for your own applications. So for example, if you need a login form for your app, a lot of applications do, what you can do is head to the samples at the marketplace, market.nativescript.org. And what's cool is that all of these samples are actually just links to the playground. So if I want to see how to build a login form, let's just say Vue this time, and I want to see how to build it with Vue. So all my code is right here. This is something I could just copy and paste and take into my own applications, or I could use this QR code to, I'll just show it here real quick. We're going to actually see what this login form looks like. So it's another fun thing to explore. If you know I need some feature for my application, you can head to the code samples. There's a chance it's already out there and ready for you to use.
Perfect. Thank you, TJ. I did want to mention that I know a lot of you have mentioned some intermittent audio issues during the webinar. Unfortunately, we're kind of at the whim of GoToWebinar and your own network connection. So we are recording this though, and we will put up something on YouTube and hopefully sneak it into the email that you're going to get after the webinar is completed today. But I did want to start tackling some of the questions you all have been asking, and there's a bunch of great ones. I think maybe we'll start with this Windows issue that you kind of mentioned, TJ, where if I'm developing on the Windows command line or command prompt or PowerShell, and you're actually not able to build for iOS locally because you don't have Xcode on Windows. And TJ did mention that you can use Sidekick for those cloud builds to build for iOS and deploy to a connected device on your Windows machine. So you don't need a Mac if you're on Windows. It can be easier in some scenarios, but really with Sidekick, we provide everything you need. But I did want to mention too that the TNS preview command that TJ mentioned does let you develop with iOS on Windows as well. There's no local dependencies required there. Now, there are the limitations that TJ mentioned in terms of certain plugins won't work, but otherwise it can actually help you get up and started pretty quickly. I happen to be on Windows most of the time, and I use TNS preview quite a bit, and it works for my iOS development just fine.
Yeah. Really, the only thing that would keep you from using TNS Preview is it's plugins and plugins that require a native compilation. So if you're doing something very, I would say native-y with NativeScript, certain plugins are going to need an actual compilation, and that's the point where you'd have to switch over to a full build. But you can actually get quite far with TNS Preview. I mean, I think we've at times built entire apps just using the preview workflow.
Yeah, it makes sense. Another question came in about dependency installations, and TJ mentioned this as well. It's kind of sort of your journey with NativeScript probably starts with the playground, since there's no installation of anything really required. And then as TJ mentioned, you can install the CLI locally. And then kind of that third step in your journey is installing those iOS and Android SDKs. Just so you know, just to not scare you off here, what that really means is just installing Xcode on your Mac generally, which is pretty much just a one-time download. And on the Android side, we pretty much have it nailed down to just having you install Android Studio, which comes with all sorts of Android SDKs and emulators and all that kind of good stuff. So it's not nearly as scary of a process as it maybe was a couple of years ago.
Yeah, and if you're going to get into native development, it's something that at some point you just have to tackle, and that's going to apply, regardless of whether you're building your apps natively or you're using some other tool, you're using NativeScript. Like there's certain things that are just inherent to mobile development that at some point you just need to bite the bullet on, for better or worse.
Yeah. And there's a question here, there's some interesting questions about HTML and using HTML for developing apps. And I think as TJ pretty much demonstrated, is that NativeScript does not support HTML because there is no DOM, right? We're not using web views. This is really native UI, which does not use HTML. And one way I like to kind of frame this is I think back, and if this may not be a super popular opinion, but I think if they were redesigning the HTML spec today, I don't think you'd have things like divs and inputs. I think you'd have a more semantic naming of your UI elements, like the way we do it in NativeScript or in React Native or any of the other native frameworks. I think you would see you can almost position our layout engine and our UI elements as almost a better version of HTML, for better or worse.
Yeah, and one reason we do it too is that, so what's actually happening under the hood is that each of the things you write in NativeScript, we sort of need you to use this language because we, under the hood, instantiate a native control for each of these things. So, for example, we couldn't let you use like divs and spans because there's no real equivalent of those things over in native land. So instead, action bar is going to be a UI navigation bar on iOS, or I think it's a like Android.widget.action bar on Android. So each of the things that you write is basically something that we're building on top of native controls. So we need to use like a native vocabulary rather than a web vocabulary.
Yeah, that's a good point. While we're on the topic of the DOM, I saw a question just came in. I try not to jump between topics too much here in our Q&A, but somebody asked a question about it. Appears there is a DOM emulator plugin on the NativeScript marketplace. How do you feel about using this to inject third-party libraries to display web content? I think that DOM plugin actually provides more DOM-friendly syntax for selecting UI elements and such. I know which plugin you're referencing. TJ, do you remember which plugin that is?
Yeah, well, if it's the NativeScript DOM one, yeah, it gives you APIs for like because since this isn't the DOM, if you need to like traverse this tree for some reason, you need to use NativeScript's APIs for doing that. But oops, I need to go to plugins.
Yeah, in terms of how we feel about this stuff, I mean, we're overjoyed when anybody creates any kind of plugin that makes somebody feel more comfortable with their migration to something like NativeScript.
Yeah, and the thing is too, even though we don't have a DOM in NativeScript, again, we do try to embrace. We want to make things as comfortable as possible for approaches that you're already taking. So, as an example of this, if you need to make an HTTP call in your NativeScript apps, we basically have a shim of XML HTTP request. And one of the reasons we do that is that so if you're using a library that under the hood is doing XML HTTP requests, it's something that you can just use in NativeScript. So for example, like Angular has a service for doing network requests. Vue has a service for performing network requests. And both those just work in NativeScript without any additional changes because we've implemented XML HTTP requests with native iOS and Android APIs. So it's something we try to do in the framework itself is sort of make some of these things work. The same is also true. One thing we've been discussing lately is Node APIs because in NativeScript we're just using JavaScript. A lot of people just bring in npm packages, right? You can just bring in underscore or Lodash or any number of things and just start using them in NativeScript right away. And one thing that's come up lately is so if I'm using some Node library that relies on say crypto and Node, one thing that you might have to do is shim something like that. So it's something that comes up and it's something that we try to make work as much as possible for people.
Perfect. I want to get to some of these other questions here. Somebody asked a question. It's a good question about the last mile of app development, especially on iOS. If any of you have developed native apps with iOS before, there's this kind of nightmare of provisioning profiles and certificates that you need to install and configure. TG, you want to talk about how like kind of Sidekick contributes to that, or even the CLI?
Yeah, so it's again like so if you haven't went through the iOS processes for deploying an app, consider yourself a little bit lucky. They're not the most fun things to go through in the world, and to a certain extent, like with NativeScript, it's something you have to go through just like you do any other tool. But as Rob was getting at, we do try to provide some things to make your lives a little bit easier. So in Sidekick, there's sort of some nice UIs for finding provisioning profiles, and also some tooling so that you can go through these steps on Windows so that you don't actually have to do some of these things through Xcode. So you'll probably find those useful. So on the NativeScript docs, which I have somewhere here, there's a whole section on actually deploying your applications. And I think I always have trouble finding this for some reason. Somewhere in here, maybe it's under releases. But anyways, we walk you through the different steps that you need to take in terms of picking provisioning profiles, certificates, all of those things. So it's documented and it's in here to help walk you through this process, and Sidekick's out there to help guide you a little bit more if you're into that sort of thing.
Cool. There's a couple of Sidekick related questions here. One is about how quickly can Sidekick build average size apps? And that's a really good question. So when you use Sidekick, you can choose to build locally or in the cloud. And if you build locally, obviously it's going to be the same exact amount of time that you would take to build an app with the CLI. If you build in the cloud, It's going to be pretty fast because our cloud servers are pretty darn fast. You're going to see some lag though in uploading your assets and then downloading the compiled file as well. So cloud builds are certainly going to be slower because of those network requests, but still pretty comparable. And in terms of how long, I don't know, maybe it's always that first build that's the longest. So maybe a minute and a half or so for an average size app, I guess I'd say. Can certainly vary though.
Yeah. The cool thing is that once you've paid the price for that build, even with cloud builds, the sort of live sync and the fast development workflow that you saw here continues to work. So you have to pay that, like Rob said, like minute, 90-second penalty of actually building your apps in the cloud. But then for development purposes, you'll still get the fast workflow. So once your app's on the device, then it doesn't really matter whether things were built in the cloud or locally.
And one other Sidekick question quickly. Somebody's asking if Sidekick is available for NativeScript 3.2. 3.2 came out a couple of years ago, I think. So the answer is no to that specific question. But just to clarify, Sidekick does require, partially for our maintenance reasons and partially just for your experience, the latest version of the NativeScript CLI. So I believe Sidekick requires 5.0 now, which there's really no reason not to update to 5.0. Provides tons of fixes and improvements.
The CLI can build back older versions of NativeScript, so I know it's not like you have to upgrade to the latest version as soon as it's available. So the NativeScript 5 CLI can build NativeScript 4 applications, but it's not going to be able to run apps back indefinitely. So at some point, you will have to upgrade at some point.
There's another really great, this is a super timely question about, someone wants to know what happened with NativeScript schematics. Is there an update? And this speaks to our code sharing story we have that TJ kind of mentioned, between being able to use your Angular web code in a NativeScript app. TJ, you want to elaborate on this a bit?
Yeah, so funnily enough, this app I'm showing here is actually built with NativeScript schematics. And so I'll show the docs in a second. But one cool thing is, so I've got this running over here that I used to build natively. But what I could also do is use the Angular CLI to build this thing for the web as well. And so it basically, for those of you that aren't familiar, that haven't used NativeScript schematics before, schematics is a term that actually comes from the Angular CLI. So the Angular CLI for building, running Angular applications, that's actually what I did with ng-serve. That's just the Angular CLI command for running a web application. Schematics is essentially an extension API. It just gives you some APIs to build on top of it. So what we did with NativeScript is make it so that you can use schematics to build apps that run on iOS, Android, and the web. And so what I was doing over here is using schematics to actually build this thing for native. But I can take this same app, and I got to go to localhost here. And I've got this exact same app that's going to be running on the web as well. And what's cool about this, let me bring it to the same monitor here, is that these things are actually using the same code base. And they're actually sharing a whole lot of the code. Like the code that actually drives this login is completely identical across both of these applications. And really the only thing I'm providing separately is just the actual UI. So I have some HTML defining this bit, and I have some NativeScript markup defining this bit, but the sort of plumbing behind all of this is exactly the same. And if you want to learn more about this, I go head over here. If you go to the NativeScript documentation, so docs.nativescript.org, there's a top-level code-sharing link under NativeScript and Angular that you can read through. It's going to have a lot more detail than what we've had time to today. So it's going to tell you about schematics. It's going to tell you about some of the newer things we've been working on with schematics. So that's what I'd recommend trying out. And just real quick, because this question comes up a lot too, code sharing at the moment with NativeScript is specific to Angular. This setup is, at least. There's nothing from a technical perspective that says we couldn't do it with Vue or couldn't do it with no framework at all. And these are things we're sort of working on right now, especially with Vue. Vue code sharing is in the works, but it's not something that we have sort of a official guided place to send you to, at least right now.
Cool. So somebody has a very specific question for which I don't have an answer, but I wanted to bring it up anyway because I think it speaks to one of our big advantages. And the question is, can I open a TCP port on my phone using NativeScript? And I honestly don't I don't know the answer to that, but I think what it does speak to is the fact that developing with NativeScript is like developing any other native mobile app. So you do have access to 100% of those device APIs. So if it can be done in Xcode or Android Studio, it definitely can be done with NativeScript.
Yeah, and it's funny, we really actually didn't get into it, but in NativeScript, and you could find this again on the NativeScript docs if you want to read more, but all of the iOS and Android APIs are there for you. And we have some documents here to walk you through the specifics of how to do that. But what's cool about that is you're never sort of locked in by NativeScript. We're not hiding anything. So the real question is there might not be like a nice, easy cross-platform API to open a TCP socket. But if you can do it in an iOS or Android app, you can do it in NativeScript. You just have to use our approach here for accessing those APIs. So they are there and you can use them.
Cool. So there is a question here. I just lost it. Here it is again. Somebody wants to know about using analytics, adding analytics to your app. And I think the short answer to that is that there is a Google Analytics plugin you can use. There's also Crashlytics that's part of the Firebase plugin, I believe. Those are the two ones that come to my mind.
Yeah, Firebase, Google Analytics is there as well. And if there's another service that you're interested in, the marketplace is a good place to search to see whether those exist.
Yeah, Crashlytics is another good example of a way to retain any of your crash reports from remote users as well. And it's something we're definitely working on going forward in 2019, is providing as the best crash reports we possibly can and not obfuscating any of those JavaScript errors. And let's see, somebody had asked earlier about, I forgot to ask this earlier when we were talking about Windows, but the creation of a Windows desktop app from NativeScript. Now, we always get questions about supporting like UWP apps, for instance, with NativeScript, and that's not something we're probably going to see anytime soon. However, in 2019 especially, we are looking towards nothing we can kind of publicly commit to right now, but we can certainly publicly comment on this idea of generating web UIs from NativeScript UIs. And if you follow that path, you can see how if we create a web UI, we could then leverage something like Electron to create a desktop app for Mac, Linux, and Windows as well. So we'll see how this story evolves in 2019. I'd like to say about a year from now, we hope we could have a pretty mature story there to develop for a ridiculous number of platforms from one code base with NativeScript, but we'll kind of have to see how that goes. And TJ has no comments on that.
you crushed that answer. It's just...
All right, let's see if we have any other questions coming in here. Sorry, it'll take me a moment to sort through these. Somebody has a question about debugging with NativeScript. Can you provide any context there?
Yeah, so if you head to tooling and debugging in the NativeScript docs, you'll find that there's a few different commands you can run from the NativeScript CLI to actually debug your applications. And the primary way that we recommend doing so is we have an integration with the Chrome developer tools that you can use to sort of debug what's going on over here on your application. So it's just going to be the TNS debug command. And you'll find that within the Chrome dev tools, the console is going to work as you'd expect. You can step through your JavaScript code. The elements pane is going to work somewhat. You can inspect your application, but we're working on letting you actually make updates through the elements pane as well and sort of tinkering with CSS. But the big things that you'd want to do in terms of just stepping through your JavaScript code, having a little console, those are going to be available through the TNS debug command. And the docs are here if you want to check them out or read further into that.
Great. So somebody just asked a heartbreaking question to me. Said I went to NGConf 2018 and did not see any representation of NativeScript there. I think we'd been at every NGConf. Maybe did we not go last year, TJ? I'm blanking now.
We didn't do like a big shirt giveaway or anything. We had some other people from Progress there, but for those of you that don't know, in previous years of NGConf, we've done some kind of silly things and given out tons of T-shirts and a bunch of stuff, and we did not do that last year. So you're sorry, maybe 2019.
Yeah, so Progress is the kind of parent company of NativeScript. We also support tools like Kendo UI, which has support for Angular baked in. And so when we sponsor conferences such as NGConf, there's kind of this like issue we have with splitting up time between a tool like Kendo UI and NativeScript as well. But one thing you should know about our Angular support is we actually work directly with the Angular team. We have somebody from my team, Sebastian. Actually, we send him to Mountain View 3 or 4 times a year, and he sits with the team to make sure we're all in alignment. And so we have a lot of fantastic support from the Angular team, and it's really been a great experience working with them going forward. All right, here, let's see. We got time for a couple more questions here. Somebody's asking about, is there a Node.js runtime, or does everything have to be transpiled to native platform code? I think I know what he's getting at, TJ, but do you have any other?
There's no Node.js runtime in the sense this usually comes up when people try to use libraries that were originally written for Node. And I know this is a discussion we've had internally about how to support some of these things. And sometimes you have to do a little bit of work to shim some of these plugins. If you do a little bit of Googling, you'll find that Eddie Verbruggen, who's one of our biggest NativeScript plugin authors, has a few articles on how to use tools like this. And so at the moment, you might have a little bit of shimming to do to make this work, but long term, we sort of want to make this sort of thing work out of the box.
Cool. There's a question earlier about font support, and I did want to just quickly mention that, yeah, you can use any font you want in your NativeScript app, and that does include font icons like Font Awesome, for instance, so you can take advantage, just like you would on the web, you can take advantage of all those fonts and font icons.
Yeah, these are font icons, or icon fonts, or whatever the proper term is in here.
And let's see. A good question that we probably can't answer too directly now, but there's a question about the Vue integration with NativeScript and the Vue router. I know this is kind of like the one gap that we have between Vue on the web and Vue in NativeScript is the ability to use the router. I don't know the technical details. I do know that there's kind of like this basic incompatibility between the way the Vue router works on the web and the way we would want it to work with NativeScript. I believe the router is being, don't quote me on this, but I think it's being rewritten for Vue 3.0. And at that point, it'll be far more compatible with the way NativeScript does things. So I think at this point, we just kind of wait and see how that evolves.
Yeah, and to be clear, you can do routing in Vue, but there's different APIs than the sort of official Vue router. So we're hoping to make that a little more seamless.
Cool. So one more question. I want to be cognizant of everyone's time here, but there's a good question to end on here. Somebody wants to know about, besides contributing to NativeScript's open source project, are there any career or hiring pages? And I would say, yeah, I mean, the first best step, if you're interested in a career with developing with NativeScript, is certainly to start contributing to our docs. It's very easy to contribute to our docs. There's a lot of issues on there that are really good for first-time contributors. You know, certainly we accept contributions to the core frameworks, to the runtimes, really to the CLI, to any part of NativeScript you want. Beyond that, we are actually on our Twitter feed. We are constantly retweeting and tweeting out folks who are interested in hiring NativeScript developers. In fact, we've had some great success stories. A friend of ours in India recently got a new job for 2 years, and he's moving to New Zealand just to do NativeScript apps. So just take a look at the @NativeScript Twitter feed, and you'll find quite a few good job leads coming in through there. Plus, I think there's a Slack channel for jobs, if I'm not mistaken. So if you join us on Slack, you can find something there.
I like ending on this question too, because it sort of points us at some other resources. The Twitter feed's a good one to keep an eye on. The other one is the NativeScript newsletter, which on the NativeScript homepage you can sign up. So we help spread the news on job opportunities through there as well. And the Slack channel, if you're interested in there, being a part of the NativeScript community there's going to be a link on the homepage there as well. So those are good sort of next steps for just keeping up on NativeScript news, whether it's job opportunities or just new framework releases, what we're working on, what events we're going to be at, all those sorts of things. So if you're not on those lists, it's a good time to just sort of jump in.
Fantastic. Well, I want to take this chance to thank you all for coming. We do repeat these about every 3 weeks or so. And again, this will be recorded if you need to review anything. But thanks for attending and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.